Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. Today I have David Oye. He's a research entomologist and lead scientist in the imported fire ant and household insects unit of USDA, United States Department of Agriculture. So we're going to talk about his work. So Dave, thanks for coming.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So why is there a special designation, it seems like, for imported fire ants?
Well, it's a very special insect. It's one of the few pests. It's a major invasive ant that has both, agricultural impacts as well as public health impacts. So it covers as well as ecological impacts. But, that public health aspect, I think, makes it unique among one of these pests. So way back when it first entered the U.S., in the 1930s, start to spread. And it's a stinging insect, and it's visible. They make these nests that have mounds that you can easily readily identify, and they're very aggressive. They come swarming out, and they'll sting you. Lots of them, and so it became a political issue also. So there are attempts to control it way back in the 40s, 30s, and then and World War II came, and so the research on that kind of got put on hold. And then after the war, there was again renewed emphasis on this. And this is in the South, and it's been spreading. So in the 50s, it spread through the nursery industry. It's been documented, throughout the South, through all the southern states. And then, the congressmen, they definitely knew the impact just from their constituents as well as probably personally, because these are stinging insects. So get onto your family farm or wherever you live, and you'll know that they're there. And so there's a lot of pressure to try and do something about this. And so this imported fire ant was designated as a target, and so that's where our funding comes from till this day.
So, great question: do they bite or do they sting, and what do they use to either bite or sting?
Okay, good question. So actually they do both, but what you're really feeling is a sting. So they have a stinger, just like a bee, but they also have jaws, like all insects have jaws. But so the ant will grab hold of your skin with its jaw that kind of stabilizes itself, and then it'll turn its abdomen down, which has a stinger at the end, and it'll sting you. And what's interesting is if you let it, you'll sting you, pull it out, and it'll rotate, and it'll sting you, and it'll pull it out. And if you let it go, it'll make a nice little circle of stings. But usually after the first one or two, you'll brush it off. But if you're incapacitated or you don't really know about it, you'll have a nice little ring of stings. And eventually these stings will develop into an itching pustule, and you'll have a little white head, and that's kind of diagnostic for the red imported fire ant. And then you'll scratch it, and it gets infected, and you'll leave a scar. And that'll take about maybe 7 to 10 days to run through that process. So it's very irritating. And if you're allergic to it, people have died from anaphylactic shock.
So in nature, I don't think these ants were designed to sting people. What do they prey on? Well,
for fire ants, they prey on many things. They're pretty omnivorous, so they'll prey on other insects. They'll prey on wildlife. It's been shown that they'll attack, like say, young quail, things nesting, or sea turtles when they're coming out of their eggs. Even in the farm situation, the cows are calving. They'll attack the calves, and they'll attack their eyes. Anything that's kind of moist, and the mucus, and then they can actually blind them. So a lot of ants will do this, especially invasive ants, to get into the wildlife areas. They'll attack things that can't defend themselves very well, and they're kind of immobile. So it runs the gamut from other insects to big vertebrates, reptiles, things like that, and also they damage crops. So the stings they won't damage things with their stinger with the crops, but they'll chew on crops.
Wow. Where do they originate from?
Originally, they came from South America. So I think some of the other scientists in our group found that they probably northern Argentina area, at least the ones that they can track back genetically. They call it the Formosa area. So that's, but it got shipped in cargo in through Alabama and Port of Mobile, and it spread from there. And there's some other evidence that they may have other introductions too.
So they've been in the U.S. for 80, 90 years. Where have they settled? Are they all over the U.S. or do they stay in the southern area? Where are they?
Yeah, so they're in the southern area. So they got as far north right now as almost, I would think, up to the middle counties of Tennessee. There's some in Virginia in the Tidewater area along the coast, which is a little warmer. It goes across through Texas. It's in California. Anything south, it's there. It's well established. Years ago, initially there was a time when they were trying to eradicate it, but it's too far gone now to try and do that type of program, trying to get rid of it.
So why do they call them fire ants? Because the sting feels like a fire?
Yeah, that's what I've heard. It feels, it burns, it's intense, and it's fast. So I guess, you can relate it to like a bee sting. I think sometimes bee sting is a little more intense, at least for me, but for fire ants, if you're not aware of it and you step on a nest, they'll just crawl up your leg and they'll start stinging all over. And so, someone like me, I'm used to it. So my head's always on the ground, eyes are on the ground looking for these things because, they can be very nasty.
Oh, you've been stung before by fire ants and bees?
Oh, yeah. There's another scientist who published his sting index, and he rated the different venomous insects and how intense their stings were. And I forgot where fire ants are, but they're definitely not the worst, but they're significant.
It sounds like those people that eat, the hottest chilies, they rate them on an index. So is there a Scoville index or a sting index?
I think it was a sting index. I don't recall the details of it, but he wrote a book on it. It's Justin Schmidt. Yeah.
Interesting. What does the U.S. government or the USDA do with fire ants? Do they just monitor where they occur, and do they try to mitigate them or stamp them out and destroy nests, or what do they do?
Yeah, so I guess the USDA has a long history of trying to control this ant, along with the universities. But early on there was some eradication programs that were involved in, so they were trying to figure out ways to control it. So initially, back then in the 50s or 30s, 40s, they had they're starting to get to that pesticide age, so they have contact insecticides that will kill the insect on contact. And so early on, there were some of those insecticides being used, and some of them turned out to be very highly toxic to mammals. And so that was stopped. And so they're trying to figure out better ways. And so they eventually developed these ant baits, which use the natural foraging behavior of ants to disperse the toxicants. So it's like a bait. So it's a food that the ants like to eat. In this case, it's soybean oil, and they'll dissolve a toxin into the oil and then put that oil with the toxin onto this corn grit. So now you'll see these in the stores. It's like a granular product, and you spread it on the ground or around the nest, and the ants will think that's as food. They'll pick it up, carry it back to their colony, and they'll suck the oil out of that grit, and they'll dispense it to the rest of the colony, and eventually they'll spread throughout the colony, and then hopefully they'll get to the queen and eventually kill the queen, as well as the rest of the colony members. That's what's developed, at the USDA. And there have been various products since then of different types of active ingredients that work on different aspects of the ants, like there's insect growth regulating active ingredients, which inhibits their development. So it's a different mode of action. So things like that. And then we work on ways to utilize that. And then we eventually moved into things like biological control agents. We're using in this case, other insects or pathogens to try and suppress the fire ant populations.
Yeah, how do they interact with other ants? Are they aggressive to them, or are there particular other creatures that they're aggressive to when they're causing a problem?
They're very, aggressive, and they're fast reproductive rate. These are fire ants now, and so that's why they're invasive. So they have their sting, and they can reproduce rapidly. So once they get a foothold, they can dominate the resources and push out the other ants or other insects, and so they kind of dominate a landscape. That's what makes them such a bad invasive insect. So they'll definitely reduce the biodiversity in the area that predominate. And so, and don't get me wrong, it's not like it's a barren wasteland just with fire ants, but there are, there's less. And there's in some areas, especially in disturbed areas, you'll see these nests all over the place. And some areas that are particularly bad, you can walk from one nest to another. It's just very bad. But then eventually they'll start to reach somewhat of a balance. They still dominate, but there's other things that move in and kind of compete with them.
And what eats them, or what competes with them?
There are other ants. I think it's probably one of the best thing, the ones that can compete with them.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
The USDA should have like an army of anteaters, that they take out like dogs to hunt these things.
Anteaters, I think we don't have them here, but there's things that eat ants, I guess. But I think they would maybe cause more damage, or they just wouldn't be able to compete. The thing with the fire ants, like other insects, are very small, and they can get into these small little niches that it's hard to access. They're sneaky, and that's also how they spread, right? They get into our commodities that we ship and move around, or they get into our equipment, or they're in soil and they spread around. So they have all the attributes to spread and survive.
The interesting is I wonder what the microbiome is like. And I was thinking it would be pretty cool to talk to a scientist that looked at the microbiome of venomous insects, across a whole bunch of them, or venomous animals. And I wonder if you'd see any interesting microbes that show up. Anyone that's looked at microbiome of ants in general, and specifically fire ants?
Yeah, there was a group in Texas that was looking at that, University of Texas. I don't know how far they got with it. They were looking specifically at fire ants. I think, one of my colleagues here, he's world-renowned in terms of discovering fire ant viruses. So it's not exactly the microbiome, but it's looking also at, using genomics to screen for viruses in fire ants and other pathogens also. So I think that's an avenue, at least for what we're trying to do here, is to improve our natural control or biological control of fire ants.
Yeah, do you know about the viruses they get, or the creatures that infect them? Are there fungi that infect them, or what tends to prey upon fire ants? Okay,
so when you think about fire ants or other ants, for that matter, they live in the soil and they have a lot of contact with microorganisms. So they've developed, or they've evolved ways to combat that. So, we know for fire ants, their venom is also antimicrobial, or they may actually have antimicrobial secretions that help, keep them clean. But there are some, we work with some that, I guess, got around that defense and has impacted them. So, I worked with, it's a microsporidium, but, it's been reclassified as a fungus. It's called Theohania solenopsis. And this was found years ago in the 1970s in some preserved specimens, and they had noticed these cysts or sacs in the abdomen. And they opened them up and they found these spores in there. And then eventually I got into a project here that was in late 90s or so, that we said, well, we know that they're here. And there was a student here at the University of Florida who worked with the USDA. We're right close to each other. And he was from Argentina. And so, he studied it down there and, looking at the life cycle and some of its impacts, and it seemed to be doing something. So the next step for us was to try and bring it into the U.S. as a biocontrol agent and see if we can get it established here. But before we did that, my former boss, they found it here naturally. They found it here anyway. It was here that we just didn't know about it. And so that opened the doors for us to work with it without all the quarantine protocols, and made it a lot easier for us to work with it. And we could document how it impacted the queen. It made her lay less eggs. It kind of debilitated her. And this is typical of a lot of microsporidian pathogens of insects. So it's a slow, debilitating type of disease that it causes. And so, we put this, actually helped distribute this throughout the South, and we found it more and more. And then it's relatively prevalent, but it does, if we carefully document it, it will reduce populations out in the field, which is something it's hard to see with pathogens because there's so many other things out there and there's a lot of fluctuation in populations, but we can show that, but it's not a silver bullet. And at the time we all thought, oh, this is great. We can cause epizootics and things like that. But no, nature is much more, I guess, more subtle.
Yeah, to be careful too. Anything you introduce to try to, stop the fire ants, it could affect plants, it could affect animals. I mean, it could have all kinds of side effects or unintended consequences.
Exactly. So, it's a big effort to bring in things that are not here naturally. We were lucky that it had already come here before, and so it was already here. And we did a lot of host specificity testing, and so it didn't affect other species of ants. In fact, we can transfer it to other fire ants. I mean, same species, only by taking their young or their brood and introducing to a colony, and they'll adopt that brood, and then somehow they get infected. But the actual mechanism, we haven't been able to figure that out, and neither has others. It's been a tough problem to actually solve, because there was thoughts of, trying to get these spores, and maybe we can help disseminate it easier than instead of using live fire ant brood or babies, right? So,
if you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
What about the venom? Is it called venom, or is it like fire juice, or what would you call the payload of the stinger?
So it's a mixture of some alkaloids. I think that's what causes the pain, and there's some proteins in there that will cause the allergic reaction. And
that's been studied and characterized. What's in it?
Yes.
But there's some ants that, there's some fire ants that, I mean, does it vary seasonally in the composition? Has it been looked at? Are there factors, depending on what they eat, that would modulate the composition of the venom?
That's a good question. I don't know the details. I know someone had studied some of those aspects, not so much the composition, but maybe the amount of venom seasonally.
Yeah, maybe you could deliberately feed the fire ants something which would reduce or change the nature of the venom so it's not so toxic. I don't know, maybe seasonally it changes. If you look at colonies, let's say in Tennessee versus South Texas, maybe they're different. The ants have been here for a while, so I'm sure they've adapted and changed somewhat. It'd be interesting to compare maybe ones from South America versus the ones that have come here and see what the differences are.
Yeah, that'd be an interesting study to explore, and I don't know how who would want to be a test on that.
Well, you don't have to have the stuff injected into you. Can, I guess look in, gas chromatograph and
that's true.
See the composition.
Exactly. Right. So interesting. One of my colleagues here, he developed a kind of like a pregnancy test to help identify fire ants, especially the red imported fire ant and the black imported fire ant. And I guess they're hybrid, and those are all quarantine pests here in the United States. And so that was an issue, trying to distinguish the specific species of fire ants, because we have some native fire ants here in the United States also that are not as, they sting, but they're definitely not as bad as the red imported fire ant. And that was based on the venom. He used some of the proteins in the venom to help. I think they were unique to the species.
So what's going to happen from here? Like, what are the latest efforts by you and other people to figure out how many of the ants are here, where are they, and to control them? Yeah,
so we're still working on the pathogens. Again, my colleague who did the viruses, he's up to, I think, number 14 now. But, and there's other groups that find pathogens in fire ants or even in ants in general. But I guess the trick is to see if they do anything. You can identify things that, through the sequencing and things like that. It's made it much more efficient to find pathogens, but to actually take it to the next step to see if it does anything that can be of use is a hard one. And we still have efforts on that. There's some that people are working with the RNA interference, looking at ways to maybe block some of the critical parts of the life of the ant to help maybe use that as a type of action. It'd be more species specific. So one of the issues with what we have now with these ant baits are they're not totally species specific. We use a oil attractant which other ants like to eat, and some of these toxins will work against them. But so there's a push there to try and find something more specific. But again, right now the issue also is delivery. So one of the most efficient ways has been the bait avenue, but maybe there's other ways we can work on that. But yeah, and again, surveillance. A lot of these as fire ants, they're spreading around the world, and that's the big issue. Is oftentimes by the time they detect it, it's too late, or it's not too late, but it's a lot harder to control. If it's they've been under the radar for a while, and next thing you know, you have a complaint, and then you find that it's over a fairly wide area and it's been spreading.
Right.
So those kinds of
Are there any good things about the ants being here?
Yeah, they're part of the ecosystem, and they've been here in the States for a while, and things have kind of, I think some places kind of balanced out a little bit. One thing for sure is they are in certain systems, sugarcane. They're a good biocontrol agents of sugarcane pests, and they'll reduce some of the caterpillars that feed on that on the sugarcane, and even in some of our crops, they'll feed on some of the pests there. Ticks. They're a good predator on ticks. I remember several years ago, Texas had a severe drought, and they were just being overrun by ticks because the fire ants are kind of suppressed due to the drought. I read one article where the rancher said he preferred to have fire ants than having all these ticks. Ticks also transmit disease, so it's a big issue, right? So they do have their benefits and also their costs, and they aerate the soil and things like that.
Do they spread any disease, the fire ants, or no? Not that anyone can tell.
Not that we know. The sting is bad enough.
Yeah. Why do they sting? They do it to disable their prey, or is there another reason?
Yeah, it's a defensive reaction. So they'll recognize a threat and they'll put out pheromones, an alarm pheromone that causes them to get all agitated, and they'll come out and they'll swarm and they'll sting whatever's in the area. And then, interesting enough, if you see I don't know how familiar you are with fire ants, but you have that mound, and you have your queen, but they'll try and protect the queen. So they'll send all these other worker ants out to sting the intruder, but they'll take that queen and try and hustle her down to safety. It's not unlike what I guess we would do for.
So which type of fire ants sting? Do all of them sting? I guess the queen can sting, but are there different classes of fire ants, some that'll sting and then other ones that come in to attack after that? Or do they coordinate their behavior around the stinging?
You mean within a colony? So
Yeah,
so the queens and the males, they don't sting. And all the worker ants, regardless of their size, they can sting. So
do they have any special ways in which they attack? Do initial ones sting and then signal to other ones, now let's swarm and attack and bite? Or do they just, those that sting also try to attack at the same time?
They're attacking at the same time. When you say attack, you mean swarm at somebody.
Maybe there's an advanced group. I'm just wondering, is there an advanced group that goes in and stings, and then other ones follow up that don't sting but just bite? And maybe is there any coordination between different types of ants in a colony where they attack in formations, or is it not that sophisticated? They just swarm and attack.
From what I've seen, and I don't think I've seen any study that looked at the coordination of attacks, and I don't think there, as far as we can tell, you disturb a nest, someone will come and one of the ants will come and sting you, and at the same time they may be releasing pheromone, and they'll have just more and more coming out to swarm and attack. I think, like I said, anything in the vicinity. But generally, you have to agitate them. I can have ants walking on me for a little bit, and until they maybe I pressed on them, then they'll try and sting me. And so, you look at different ant species. Some are not as aggressive that you can press them pretty hard, or they can crawl over you and they won't have this alarm reaction. So
okay, well, very good, David. What's ahead for the future in working with these ants for you?
We're still looking at trying to, if we can, bring in more pathogens. There was one that we've been working on for a while, but then working with other governments, I think there's these export permits, and that's gotten pretty difficult the last few years. I guess when governments change, they have different procedures, and and they're becoming, I guess, more protective of things coming out of their countries. But we'll still be working on pathogens there. And we've been expanding into other invasive ants. So just another thing to be working on. And we're looking at the similar types of things, looking at pathogens. We have our fire ant group there has a range of expertise, and we, work together on different aspects of it. So.
Okay, very good. Well, David, where can people find out more about the USDA's work with fire ants and your work?
Yeah, so we have a website. So I think if you just type in USDA fire ants, there's 2 fire ant labs, one in Mississippi and there's one here in Florida, Gainesville, Florida, and both work on fire ants and other invasive ants, and you can see the whole range of things that we do.
Well, very good, David. Thank you for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Oh, great. Well, thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.